Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now you can hear me. I can interrupt your conversations. Welcome to tonight's President's Lecture. My name is John Meeser, and I'm a visiting instructor here in the History Department. I teach modern Middle Eastern history. Tonight's lecture is named the Ezio Cappadocia Memorial Lecture, and I'd like to point out that Ezio's wife Helen is with us this evening, and it's only through her kind and generous support that this portion of the lecture series has been brought to Missoula. Helen's gift memorializes her parents, who are actually alumni who studied here at UM in the 1920s. So thank you, Helen. I'm not used to having lights on me when I talk, but I'm going to make an assumption by waving my hand to also thank President Dennison for his support for the lecture series and for everything he does for the university. Tonight's speaker, Professor Juan Cole, has spent a few years, you always never want to date people when you introduce them, trying to put the Muslim world broadly into context, historically, socially, religiously, for people of North America, of the United States. And I think that that's a valuable trait. In our field of Middle Eastern studies, there tends to be a lot of political intrigue and vitriol. And he's somebody that I think transcends that, though he certainly has had enough slings and arrows thrown his way in the process. Born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, he became interested in the Islamic world at a very young age, when his father was based in Eritrea, I believe what is today Ethiopia, actually, but we'll just, always have to confuse you. But it is a country that's half Muslim and half Christian, and it sparked an interest in him. Gifted with languages, I can say kindly, he's fluent in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and of course English, and I would imagine Spanish as well, yes. So tonight he'll be speaking to us in English. But it is a huge gift and a window into that part of the world to have such language abilities. Not all of us can be such polyglots. But this allowed him to get interested in the religion and the culture and the peoples of the region in a way that quite often even, scholars of the region that teach in North America don't have such a wide scope. It's something that's almost taken away from. In graduate school, we study such very narrow things to earn a PhD. And so I think that he's a brave man to have tried to keep his scope large. But I think in the last couple of days I've figured out how he did that, and I'll get it to when I get to his education. He did his undergraduate degree at Northwestern, and then picked up and went and lived in Beirut. Now, at the time, a wonderful decision, I'm sure, and I don't think he had anything to do with it, but almost immediately it was the precursor and the beginning of the civil war in Lebanon. So he chose, wisely, I would say, to pursue his studies then in Cairo instead of in Beirut, and did his master's degree in Cairo in Arab and Islamic studies, before returning to Beirut once again for an extended stay, and then coming back to the United States to do his PhD at UCLA. His PhD was on transnational movements. You gotta love academics, right? We come up with these fantastic terms. Movements of Shia Muslims all the way from India and Afghanistan to Lebanon, and the connections they had between them. Now, I haven't heard the story, but I would imagine that his advisors and people that were, schooling him in his PhD studies thought that this probably was too large if they had even heard of these things. But having been someone who's lived in that part of the world, they do have very strong networks through mosques and through smaller social networks. I'm sure he'll touch on this tonight. He started at the University of Michigan in 1984 and became a full professor in 1995, where he's been ever since in Ann Arbor. From 1999 to 2004, Professor Cole was the editor of IJMIS, as we would call it, the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. We're not all that creative in titles. But it is the most prestigious journal in our field and covers all disciplines. And I think it's given him a scope of knowledge which you can see in his remarks tonight. He was also president of the Middle East Studies Association in 2005. His own work, aside from the transnational networks I talked about, and no, I won't list off everything he's done, it would take us the rest of the evening, but he has translated 3 volumes of Khalil Gibran's work, something that may be familiar with many people in the room. And his last 2 books are Napoleon's Egypt Invading the Middle East, which had great resonance with the then concurrent American invasion of Iraq, and Engaging the Muslim World, the book he'll be speaking about this evening. His scholarship, though, a lot of scholars in the room, transformed itself into quite a public image over the last decade. And I think he became what we would call, of course, a very much public intellectual. And I think it was by choice, as much as being dragged kicking and screaming into the politics of the Iraq War and the post-9/11 environment. He was an early adopter of information technologies by setting up academic email lists and other things for scholars to be able to communicate, which really enriched a lot of our knowledge. Now, that may not help the public, and he took the next step in 2002 by starting a blog, which I don't think at the time many of us had ever heard of, but it brought him quite a bit of attention, good and bad, I'm sure, but allowed all of us a window into his mind, his thinking, and a wider view of the region where he could bring these things together, whereas many scholars like myself have much more narrow interests and can't tie these things together. On the blog, if you're not a regular reader, I'm sure there's a few in the room, he provides commentary on current events, commentary on the Middle East region, and most importantly, translations of local press from Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. So it allows all of us a window, if we don't have such language capabilities, to see what the debates are. The list that has sprung from that of his contacts in the Western media, the English language media, are quite long, and in fact they take up my whole page. And I'm always worried about that because I don't like listening to introductions that go on forever, and so I didn't want to do that tonight. And one solved my problem last night. He said, it's very simple. Just tell them, he was on the Colbert Report in 2004, so he has now reached the pinnacle of media celebrity in our country. I think everything else will fall into a second place. A further initiative in the public realm that I think should be noted, and I'm sure I didn't ask, but I'm sure he would appreciate if it's discussed with him afterwards, is he started something called the Global Americana Institute. And this sort of confounds many, perhaps, of his critics, in the sense that it's an effort that he's brought about to translate the core texts of American democracy, Jefferson, etc., into Arabic, Urdu, and the rest of the languages of the region, and to be able to promulgate them there so people will understand the bases of American democracy instead of perhaps its more darker sides in action. Lastly, I would just like to say that as a strong critic of the Bush administration, that also brought attention. We're not here to review that tonight. I'll leave that to him. But I think that it missed the mark, because I don't think, if you read Professor Cole's blog, and certainly his scholarship, that it really has much to do with politics per se. He criticizes, or he tries to engage with, our use of language, not people in the Middle East. Whether we say Islamic, Islamist, Islam, that those things have meaning, and that we should, think about how we use them before we use them. That we need to take a sober look at our own actions and their implications in the world and in our own society, to take a pause. That we need an improved engagement with the Muslim world, as tonight's talk will highlight. That we need a clear reassessment or assessment of the implications and potential actions of our government, of our society, of our culture, in how it portrays Muslims, engages with Muslims, etc. In sum, I would say that he appeals to us to stand up for our best virtues: democracy, tolerance, freedom of speech, and a pragmatic public discourse, which is in the strongest tradition of American letters. Juan Cole.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you for all of you for coming out this evening, where you had to brave rather cold weather to come hear me. And I'm going to try now to warm things up. There may be some fireworks. I want to talk tonight about engaging the Muslim world, a subject which I would argue is at the center of American foreign policy. And let me begin, as was mentioned, I was a critic of the Bush administration's approach to the region. And we just heard a speech at West Point launching a war, or relaunching one. It was a war, however, in Afghanistan against forces that had attacked the United States. A different kind of speech was given at West Point in June of 2002 by George W. Bush, in which he put forward a doctrine of preemptive war. Now, there's lots of grounds for launching a war. If you're eyeball to eyeball with the enemy and you think he might come at you any second and get the drop on you, maybe there's a point in launching a preventive war. But Bush's doctrine of preemptive war seemed to be that if there's somebody out there, somewhere, that might someday attack you or consider it, better to take care of business now. It's a doctrine that would lead to lots of wars, and I think an unwise doctrine. In the previous administration, there was a preference for military solutions to political problems in the region. As I said, I think the Afghanistan War of 2001-2002 is perfectly understandable and a war that I supported because there were 40 terrorist training camps in Afghanistan, and if you had left them there, they would have gone on training terrorists to hit the United States. That was their purpose in life. But then disputes with the Saddam Hussein regime, which I think did not rise to the level of a casus belli. There was no grounds for a war with Iraq, and international law were handled militarily. Ultimately, the war was expanded to Pakistan with drone attacks, which are troubling because they are directed by the CIA. So they are covert operations. Nobody can talk about them. And they're not, it's defense departments or war departments that are supposed to fight wars. Having a covert operation fight a war of drones and really assassinate people who haven't been tried or proven to be on the battlefield is troubling. Unfortunately, there is an element of continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration on two of these three. I would argue that the invasion of Iraq introduced substantial instability into the Eastern Mediterranean, not just Iraq. It affected Turkey. It has, I think, yet to subside. We could still see major trouble in Iraq. And obviously a spread of instability in South Asia. Then there were the instances of symbolic humiliation of Muslims at Guantanamo, at Bagram base, at Abu Ghraib, setting dogs on people, stress positions, nudity, sexual humiliation. Wolf Blitzer once had me on CNN and after the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. And he wanted me to explain to him the Arab mentality, that they would be so upset to have these pictures of them nude and sexually humiliated spread around in their villages, and that this was a way for the U.S. military to convince them to talk, that they would hold this threat of passing the photographs around. And I fear Wolf won't have me back on because I said, Mr. Blitzer, I think I and most other Americans would also be rather reluctant to have pictures of ourselves in those positions spread around in our hometowns. He wanted me to tell him how the Arabs were different. And the Bush administration and the Republican Party more generally from 2006 forward began speaking, well, Bush slipped up once and talked about launching a crusade. This was not well received in the Middle East, where there are certain memories that persist Our image of the Crusades over here is Richard the Lionheart and chivalry and so forth, but there was that little incident where all the Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem had their throats slit, which they don't forget. And then they began talking about Islamic fascism, Islamic terrorism, and this kind of rhetoric, which really became a partisan issue in the United States. That is to say, I think the Republican National Committee encouraged the candidates to use it, and the Democratic National Committee decided to avoid it because none of the Democrats talked this way. And they were attacked by Republican candidates like Rudy Giuliani for not talking this way. And Giuliani was challenged, and he said, well, who would be offended by the phrase Islamic terrorism except Islamic terrorists? Well, Rudy, let me try to explain to you why that's offensive. It's a matter of English diction. There are some words in the English language that have certain connotations. Now, at the University of Michigan, we have a Center for Judaic Studies. Judaic, not Jewish. Why is it Judaic rather than Jewish? Well, Judaic is an adjective that describes the ideals of the Jewish tradition. So, Bugsy Siegel had something to do with the founding of Las Vegas. That was not a Judaic set of activities that Bugsy was involved in. So, you can't have a Judaic gangster. You could have a Jewish one. In the same way, there's a difference between Islamic and Muslim. We can talk about Islamic ethics, even Islamic art, the ideal things in the Islamic tradition. But there are no Islamic burglars. And likewise, there can't be an Islamic terrorist, because terrorism is forbidden in the Quran and in the Muslim tradition. So these phrases, Islamic fascism, Islamic terrorism, and so forth, were the sources of great protest and anxiety throughout the Muslim world. I mean, obscure editorialists in Indonesia had at Bush and Giuliani and others over these things. It made a bad impression. Luckily, I think the new administration has abandoned that kind of talk. President Barack Obama launched a New Year's message to Iran in which he urged Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions and to give up terrorism, and pledged an engagement, direct talks with Iran. Spoke for the first time about the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is what the country calls itself, but which no American president has been willing to call it. The message was well received among the Iranian public. We were saying at dinner that in Persian, u means he, ba means with, and ma means us. So the pro-Obama Iranians said, Uba mast, he is with us. That's what his name means. The supreme leader in Iran, Ali Khamenei, gave a speech in which he said, well, we've suffered a lot at the hands of the Americans. They overthrew our government in 1953 and imposed a megalomaniacal Shah on us. Now, we have forgotten about the Shah, but he was a CIA project. And he was petulant and controlling, micromanager of everybody's lives. And then over time, he got more and more big for his britches. He started styling himself the King of Kings in the old ancient Iranian Achaemenid way, the light of the Aryans. He didn't seem to realize that Hitler had rather thrown that kind of terminology into disrepute. And he started wearing these fancy fur uniforms and capes and things. He looked over time more and more like a cross between Liberace and Michael Jackson. But then he was deploying a secret police to spy on people, and he had more prisoners of conscience, people who were in jail for speaking their minds, had committed no crime, than the Soviet Union did. So the Iranians were outraged. They overthrew him and instituted their present government. So Obama was trying to overcome a difficult history where the U.S. had Iran under its thumb and the Iranians had escaped that. And so Ali Khamenei said, well, let's see what he does. We've heard what he said. That's good. But let's see the practical change in policy. And to this speech by Ali Khamenei, which was admittedly standoffish and suspicious, but open to the possibilities, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all of the major American media said, Iran rejects Obama's overture. It's not what the man said. Didn't reject it. Said, took a wait-and-see attitude. Then Obama went to Turkey. Turkey is, by the way, a lot of Americans don't realize this, a NATO ally of the United States, and has troops fighting in Afghanistan. So had fought with us in Korea. So he addressed the Muslims in Turkey, and then in June he made a major address to the Muslims in Cairo. And I think these efforts to show respect to the Muslim publics, to reach out to them after the previous 8 years were extremely welcome. Obama is wildly popular in the Muslim world. I know people who were in the audience in Cairo when he addressed the crowds there, and they said that the Western media didn't convey the full electricity and enthusiasm that was in that room. The people were just going wild for Obama. He was like a rock star. And they said even, the people with the beard and the conservative fundamentalists in the audience were smiling and saying, "Go Obama." Yes, we can. His address was widely popular because it showed respect, it quoted the Quran, and so forth. Now, however, I think people in the region want to see the results of his policies. And opinion polling tells us that the Muslim publics don't care about the American way of life in the way that our politicians told us, that they hate us for our way of life. Actually, this got all the way back to Osama bin Laden, and he was annoyed. And in one of his videotapes, he said, no, we didn't hit you because of your way of life. If we had hated your way of life, we would have hit Sweden. So people in the Middle East have a problem with the United States. It's with U.S. policy. The number one policy problem for them is Iraq. The people in the Arab world don't consider the U.S. occupation of Iraq to be friendly. They consider it a foreign, aggressive military occupation. And they consider Iraq part of their Arab world, and they want the U.S. out. Now, it so happens that so does Obama. And in fact, I think there's every evidence he's getting us out. So that's promising. I think they'll be happy about that. Then another big issue for the Arab world is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Obama has come out for a two-state solution, one that he wants to see implemented in a short timetable. It's the least good conjuncture for such a thing we've ever had in history, so it's not going to be easy. But certainly that's what the people in the region want, is a Palestinian state. And so if Obama can make progress on that, I think that also will help relations. And then, of course, in general, the people in the Middle East are tired of Westerners interfering with their lives as they see it. And, this is something that we Americans are unfairly blamed for in the region, that we are seen as a continuation of the European empires. Now, we don't even know about the European empires, so we kind of are shocked when people complain about our continuing them. But, while we were not paying attention, the French invaded Algeria in 1830. They occupied the country. and held on to it till 1962. Well, that's a long time. And while they were there, they grabbed up the best land for their colonists, and they rejiggered law to favor them, and they branded Islam a fanatical religion and tried to introduce Roman Catholicism, and they generally managed to royally anger the Algerians. They also tried to make Arabic a kitchen language and have everybody speak French and be very shishi, which appealed to a certain number of Algerians. But from 1830 to 1962, the British showed up in what is now Bangladesh, 1857. I meant to say 1757. And they stayed until 1947. 200 years. British, actually, originally they were a company. It was the East India Company. It would be as though Microsoft invaded Thailand and ran it for a while. I don't know, maybe Burma would declare for the Macs. But it was the East India Company, a corporation, invaded India and took it over. And British sort of merchants on the make were suddenly in charge of armies and running people's lives and making law for Bengalis. And this goes on for 200 years. So, there's this rant that's popular on YouTube, and it's a British gentleman complaining about the Muslims coming to Europe. He's saying, they're not from here, but they're coming to our countries, and they want to make our laws. And I thought, well, payback is a bitch. What were you doing for the last 200 years? Unfortunately, when Iraqis see white Christians in tanks in their streets, they don't think Thomas Jefferson came to save us from tyranny. They think, oh no, they're back. How would we get them back out of our country? Because they fought anti-colonial wars all through the 20th century. So the one thing that Obama has invested in this Afghanistan war is, I think, not promising with regard to the welcome it's going to get in the Muslim world. Now, I have an implicit assumption in this talk, obviously, that it is possible to engage with the Muslim world. And some might say, well, they don't want to engage with us. They don't like us. The people who say that, on the whole and by and large, I don't think know any Muslims and have never actually lived in the region. Because all the polling shows that Pakistani public, the Saudi public, and the Saudi public, they're like, Saudi Arabia has this peculiar form of Islam, or this distinctive form of Islam called Wahhabism. And they're kind of suspicious of innovation, technological innovation, interactions with foreigners. So they're very insular. They're not pacifists. So I kind of think of them as sort of militant Amish. So it's not the most, frankly, open-minded culture in the world. But you ask them, would you like better relations with the United States? They say yes. Even the Saudis, 68%. And you ask them, well, what would you like? They say more visas to visit the United States. Apparently, they want to go to Disney World. And the Pakistanis also, they say, we want better relations with the United States, but please, don't send us all those fancy F-16s and things. We have enough of those. We need better medical care, we need schools, we need that kind of help. So, but they say they want better relations with the United States in the opinion polling. There's a poll in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia, but they stripped him of his Saudi citizenship, and since the early 90s, he's been a wanted man, really, in Saudi Arabia, which makes it very ironic, that the Americans often blame Saudi Arabia for him. But it's kind of like blaming the United States for Al Capone. I mean, it's not as if like someone we supported. So the Saudis consider him an outlaw. But he had fought against the Soviets and raised money from mosques and millionaires to fight the godless Soviets in Afghanistan. And at the time, he was doing Ronald Reagan's work and was one of those people Ronald Reagan praised as a freedom fighter. And so that was his reputation in Saudi Arabia. And when 9/11 happened, a lot of Saudis couldn't believe that Osama bin Laden could be a mass murderer. Wasn't he the glorious hero who got the Soviets out of Afghanistan? And so you would see these troubling polls, 25%, 30% support bin Laden, and people in the United States were worried about where the Saudis' heads were at. But it was because the Saudis didn't believe that he had done it. Now it's gradually seeped into their consciousness. So in a recent poll, 10% of Saudis said that they thought well of al-Qaeda. 90% did not. 82% said that fighting terrorism should be the #1 job of the Saudi government, because al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had blown up things in Riyadh. Chickens had come home to roost in Saudi Arabia. So the public became alarmed. So they talk like Bush about terrorism and need to fight terrorism. Then the pollsters did a cross-sectional analysis of the people who said that they thought well of al-Qaeda. Also, 82% of them said that fighting terrorism should be the #1 job of the Saudi government. So when the al-Qaeda supporters are worried about terrorism, it's a serious issue. But actually, of course, what it means is that they don't believe al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. They think of it still in those old 1980s terms. Now, in the last few years, we've had a rhetoric about Islam and about the Muslim world from our politicians and some of our other community leaders, which has, in my view, attempted to replace the Soviet Union with the Muslims. I think that the right in the United States misses the communists. It was rather a cruel blow to them when the Russians just gave up and said, okay, no, now we're businessmen. Because if you think about it, Richard Nixon got his start in politics running against communism for Congress. Now, I don't think that the Communist Party of the United States ever won any elections to speak of. And I don't think there were more than about 50,000 of them in the whole country. But the Republicans and some Democrats regularly beat their opponents by warning people that, have you checked recently under your bed? There might be a communist there. And then they exaggerated what the Soviet Union was. Apparently, once the curtain fell and we could see it, they seem mostly to have outhouses rather than bathrooms, and I don't think they were very much of a threat to us, certainly not the way it was hyped. But then they're gone, and we're the sole superpower, and who would you use to frighten people? How would you win those elections again? Because you can't go to them and say, well, we're not going to give you any services, and there's nobody you should be afraid of. So I think they were wanting to take 9/11 and run with it, and to have al-Qaeda and the Muslim world more generally substitute for the red menace. Now you have a green menace. And I've heard speeches. I was at the New America Foundation, and a congressman came from New Jersey and gave this speech on the challenge to the United States of the Muslim world. And for me, it was like reading Lewis Carroll. I mean, the things that this man said bore no relationship to reality. It was like we had to believe 7 impossible things before breakfast. He depicted the Muslim world as large and out there and menacing and, the challenge. And then John McCain, when he ran for president, he said the reason that he wanted to be president, the reason that John McCain wanted to be president was not to improve the lives of Americans. That's not what he said. He said it's to fight the supreme and transcendent challenge for the United States in the 21st century, which is radical Islamic extremism. I don't know, that seems to me redundant as a phrase, but that was what he said. That was the thing that drove him. Now, is that really the transcendent challenge of the 21st century for the United States? Wouldn't, like, China be a challenge? I like the Chinese. I'm not fond of the communist government of China, but you know, they amount to something. They have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have nuclear weapons. They're growing their economy 10% a year. Walmart has, you know, become their official American agent. And wouldn't that be a challenge of some sort to the United States? A few scruffy guys with beards in caves, that's the transcendent challenge. We're reduced to that. So then I was thinking about this. Well, what is this man talking about? The congressman who was talking about the Muslim world as a challenge to the U.S. or as a danger to the U.S. So I started thinking, well, okay, let's map this onto my reality. Let's start on a map with Morocco, a Muslim country. Arabic speaking. Well, they're also Berbers. Morocco, a conservative monarchy. Major trading partners, the United States and France. Friendly to the US. Is Morocco part of this new challenge to the US? Clearly not. We do joint military operations with them. Well, let's move over then. You have Algeria. I'm looking for what this congressman was talking about. I can't find it. Algeria. Algeria is run by a secular elite, very close to Paris and the US. Spent the last 15 years fighting almost a civil war with the Muslim party, with the religious activists. Something on the order of 120,000 people died in this civil war, which the secularists won. When I'm on the radio, sometimes the host will ask me, he'll say, well, why don't the Muslims do something about these Muslim radicals in their midst? How come we have to take them on? And I say, well, you know, tens of thousands of people were killed in Algeria over this issue since the early 90s. What do they want? A genocide? So Algeria, very friendly to the United States, a secular government. Then you have Tunisia. Zayn bin Ali is a kind of soft dictator, very pro-American, very pro-French. Security forces cooperate with the US. Libya, well, nobody can understand what that man is saying. Egypt. Egypt is, Mubarak's government is very close to the United States. And again, we have joint military exercises. The US gives Egypt $2 billion a year. Does that sound like the Soviet Union to you? Is that an enemy? Mubarak, you know, has been there since 1981. And some people do blame us that we support Mubarak so heavily. $2 billion a year is a lot of support. And some people are tired of Mubarak in Egypt, and they kind of wish the US wouldn't prop him up so much. There's a joke the Egyptians tell that Mubarak is over 80 now, and so his advisors came to him and said, Mr. President, don't you think it's time that you said goodbye to the Egyptian people? Mubarak is kind of astonished. He looks at them, he says, why? Where are they going? I can't talk about Jordan's relationship to the United States because it's, you know, kind of embarrassing. how much in our back pockets they are. Saudi Arabia, old-time ally, pumps extra oil for us. Kuwait, again, it's embarrassing. Pakistan, a non-NATO ally of the U.S. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Turkey, a NATO ally. Indonesia, friendly to the U.S. So where is it? Where is this bulking Soviet Union-like thing out there threatening us from the Muslim world? I can't find it. It's not on the map. The Soviet Union had many drawbacks, but it existed. It had tanks, it had a location. I can't find this thing they're talking about now. Now you could say, okay, there's Syria and Iran. We have bad relations with them, and maybe the Sudan. Although, I remember they asked Colin Powell one time about the Sudan. Colin said, oh, they've been very cooperative in the war on terror. I'm afraid to inquire exactly what they did for us. So I color-coded this map by secular pro-American Muslim countries, which is the blue, and conservative pro-American Muslim countries, which is kind of light yellow, and then secular enemies of the United States, which is Syria, the one little red thing there, and conservative anti-American countries, which is Iran. So that's it. That's Iran and Syria. That's what they're talking about. That's the Soviet Union. The Syrian population is 20 million. Its per capita income is $5,000 a year. Doesn't amount to anything. Doesn't have an air force to speak of. It's a secular Arab regime. It's not Islamic. It kills Al-Qaeda. That's the menace? Syria? Really? That's what you've got? Then Iran. Again, a poor third world country. Per capita income in exchange terms, $2,000 a year. 70 million population. No air force to speak of. 84 military aircraft listed. Some of them are Nixon and Kissinger gave them to the Shah in the 1970s. That's it? That's what you're afraid of? So I can't find it. In fact, I find allies. And formal allies. Turkey, population 70 million, a major Muslim country, increasingly run by a Muslim-tinged government of Erdogan, is a NATO ally. It's like France. I mean, better than France, because the French, pulled out of the military side of NATO for a long time, but the Turks have always been in it. And then the president can designate non-NATO allies. We have 14 formally designated non-NATO allies. And they get a special status in the law. They can import more sophisticated weapons from us and so forth. 6 of the 14 non-NATO allies are Muslim countries. Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Pakistan. Non-NATO allies. So there's been a lot of hyping of the so-called threat from the Muslim world, and in the wake of 9/11 you could understand why that may be. But it is stereotyping and it is inaccurate. So the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not fundamentalists. And even the ones who are what we would call fundamentalists are not necessarily anti-American. During the early 21st century, the United States squandered enormous amounts of goodwill in the Muslim world. In 2000, 75% of Indonesians said they had a favorable or very favorable view of the United States. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, over 200 million in population. 75% jumping up and down for joy about the United States in the year 2000. You know what the favorability rating of the United States and Indonesia is today? 15%. I'd say we did something to disappoint them. It was the invasion of Iraq, very clearly, that sent the numbers down. Turkey. 56% say they think favorably or very favorably about the United States. And this is despite the fact the U.S. has backed military coups that oppressed them and destroyed their labor unions. It backed the military in a dirty war against the Kurds. The U.S. has done things that you could reasonably object to in Turkey. But still, 56% felt that the United States was a great place. They're favorable or very favorable towards it. And I feel this when I go to Turkey. In Istanbul, you get in the cab, people ask you, where are you from? You say the United States. Oh, they want to turn around and hug you. They say, oh, we love the United States. Under Bush, favorability rating of the United States in Turkey fell to 9%. So I'd say we were doing something wrong if what we wanted was good relations. Now, another point that could be raised is whether it matters. Should we care? Well, yes, it matters, and we have to care. Edward Luttwak, one of these conservative columnists, wrote a couple years ago a column. He said, I think they were, disappointed in what happened in Iraq because they had such bright dreams for the enterprise, and then it didn't turn out the way they thought. So he said, well, we should just turn our back on the Muslim world, not have anything to do with them. Stop worrying about them. And he went on to say, I swear, this is Luttwak, not me, don't blame me. He said, the Italians discovered that, if they paid too much attention to Sicily, it always backfired. You should just leave backward regions alone. So, I think the premises of Luttwak's article could be challenged, and that it's very disturbing in many ways. But it's not going to work with the Muslim world. First of all, world population the population growth in some parts of the world is slowing or reversing. If the Russians go on like they are now, they're not going to be any in 100 years. Or they'll be largely Muslim. The Muslim areas of the world, however, are high natality. Also, the Japanese, the Japanese are shrinking. They're 120 million. If they go on like this, they'll be 90 million soon. I was in Tokyo not so long ago, and there was a house on sale. Actually, it didn't seem so bad because Tokyo real estate prices were high, but this is after the bubble burst. And my Japanese friend teased me and said, would you like to buy that house? And I said, no. If you guys are going down from 120 million to 90 million, I wouldn't predict a bright future for your real estate market. So Germany, a lot of countries, they're either flat on population or starting to lose them. Now, if you're in that situation, you only have two choices. One would be to go the Japanese path and shrink your population and take the risks, because there are risks, having a small group of Japanese young people working night and day to support this big cohort of little old Japanese old people, that could cause social tensions. And some of the Japanese young people already got green hair, so who knows where this could go. I think it's one of the reasons the Japanese keep working so hard on that Asimo robot. That would be the only solution. Or you could do what Germany did, which was to bring in guest workers. And the Germans initially, they called them guest workers, and it was pointed out that it's kind of a contradiction in terms because you don't usually make your guest clean the house. But they had this phrase, Gastarbeiter. And the German officials who set up the guest worker program in the 60s thought that they would bring the guest workers in from elsewhere, have them work as long as they were needed. If there was an economic slowdown, they would cancel their visas and send them back. And so literally millions of Turks came to Germany. And it turns out, that you're not bringing in widgets. You're bringing in human beings. They settle, they marry, they have families. You can't send them back so easily. They resist And so you end up with 4 million Muslims in Germany. I think this is delicious divine justice on the Germans who wanted to be so rein and pure of non-German ethnicities. Well, they're not going to be. They're going to be multicultural, and they'd better get used to it. In fact, they now have 200,000 Jews as well. It's about the same number they had in 1939. So I think the new Germany, has serious issues with this, but it has happened. And it's the future of Europe. If Europe has a choice of economic decline or of importing Muslim labor, because it's the Muslims who are now having the children in the world. It is Egypt, and it is Bangladesh, and it is Africa, and so forth. So they're going to probably, there are 1.5 billion. They're probably going to be about a third of the world population by 2050. And I put it to you, if the United States wants to remain a superpower and wants to stride the global stage, it can't do so if it has a third of humankind as its enemy. So it's going to need, the world is going to need the Muslims. They're going to be the labor pool of the future. Then, of course, there are security concerns that are joint between the Muslim world and the United States. We are asking Pakistan's government and the Karzai government in Afghanistan to partner with us in defeating the Taliban. This is not a U.S. versus Muslim war. It's the U.S. plus Muslims, plus Muslims, plus Muslims, anti a handful of radicals. And then there's the 600-pound gorilla, which is energy. We need the Muslim world because it has energy, and we are incurable gas hogs. The United States uses 20 to 21 million barrels of petroleum a day. That's million barrels of petroleum a day. 21. The whole world only produces 86 million barrels a day of petroleum. Now, we're 5% of the world's population, but we use a quarter of all the world's oil every day. You know those chairs you're sitting on made out of petroleum. Your jeans and rayon and a lot of your clothing, petroleum. You got here driving your cars, petroleum. It's our civilization. There was a music video by the Lebanese/Colombian star Shakira 2 or 3 years ago, La Tortura. It was, the conceit of the video was that she was remembering a lover's betrayal. At some points in the video, for reasons that are not entirely clear, she was covered in black oil. I don't know, maybe this was just the producer wanted to see it. But in any case, I thought it was a wonderful icon for us all. We're all covered in black oil. Now, we have a shortfall. If you do the math, 12 to 13 million barrels a day, because we only produce 5 million barrels a day of petroleum ourselves, and we produce another 3 million of liquefied hydrocarbons of various sorts, including ethanol. But it's 8 million we produce. We need 21. That's a shortfall. And where are we going to get the rest of it? Well, our number one provider is Canada. Our number two provider is Saudi Arabia. Our number three provider is Mexico. But the Mexicans are not reliable in this regard. The Mexican reserves are shallow. They're using them up. Their production falls every year. Last year it fell 14%. This year it will fall 8%. And then they're starting to like to drive themselves. So they're starting to use their own petroleum. And so by 2014, not so long from now, we may get nothing from Mexico. That's the story that a gas hog doesn't want to hear. That's a friendship in trouble. The kind of friend we want would have vast reserves of petroleum, would pump it at our request in as big a volume as we asked for, and would have small little populations and wouldn't be interested in using it themselves. That's a real friend to a gas hog. Do you want to know the names of those particular kinds of friends? Yes. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. You get the picture? You want $100 billion in reserves? I mean 100 billion barrels of reserves? That's going to be in the Gulf region or in Central Asia. You want small populations not using it all themselves the way those selfish Mexicans are starting to do? I say find a Muslim, make a friend. The United States, our politician, Nixon started this thing, and you know if he started it, it's got no good future. Nixon started saying we're going to be energy independent. We want to be energy independent. And now President Obama, I like President Obama. I don't mean to be hard on him. But he said we're going to be green in 10 years. And, well, it's nice, to set a goal. But you're not going to be green in 10 years. We're going to be more entangled in the oil-producing Middle East 10 years from now than we are now. And more entangled yet 20 years from now. So that's another point on which we can't just do what Luttwak said and tell the Muslims to jump in a lake and never hear the word again. Now, as I said, I think that the big issues in the Middle East are ones on which the Obama administration's policies will receive a fair hearing. I think we are getting out of Iraq on the timetable announced late in the Bush administration. We're already down from the height of 160,000 troops in Iraq. We're now down to about 120,000, a little less. We will be down to 110,000 by January, according to General Ray Odierno. By late August of 2010, we'll be down to 40 or 50,000. And by December 31st, 2011, we will be completely out of Iraq. And I think that's going to happen, and on that time scale, barring a massive catastrophe of some sort. And I think that it will greatly improve our relations with the Muslim world and the Arab world that we do this. With regard to Israel and Palestine, well, that's not going well, but never give up hope. You have the most right-wing government in Israeli history, led by Bibi Netanyahu. You have his foreign minister, who is kind of the Ahmadinejad of Israel, once said, well, the Egyptians give us any trouble, we'll just bomb the Aswan Dam. Whole country would be in the Mediterranean. Who says things like that? Avigdor Lieberman began his career as a nightclub bouncer in Moldavia. And he now wants to bounce the Israeli Arabs from the club. So it's not a promising configuration on the Israeli side. And then on the Palestinian side, you have Mahmoud Abbas, who just announced that he can't take it anymore. It's kind of a Sarah Palin move. Wants to resign from his position. Admittedly, he lasted longer than 18 months. And Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, which is, a political party / terrorist organization. So that's not a promising configuration for peace. I want to give you that. Obama has a steep hill ahead on him. In fact, it's kind of like, a bad bar joke. One day, Avigdor Lieberman, Bibi Netanyahu, Mahmoud Abbas, and Ismail Haniyeh and Hillary Clinton walk into a bar But the Obama administration wants to try to get these guys together and hammer out a two-state solution. And that's very important because Israel's future depends on there being a quick attainment of a Palestinian state. If there is not one, then you're going to move towards apartheid. The Palestinians are stateless. They are oppressed. The rest of the world is going to start boycotting Israel. And you already see this happening to some extent. And it gives me the chills because, you know, Jews were boycotted in the 1930s. You don't want to see that kind of thing come back. But people are making an analogy to South Africa and so forth. And then if the Palestinians are stateless, it's unacceptable in the modern world to have a stateless population. Somebody's going to have to give them citizenship. And if they can't have a Palestinian state, then people are going to pressure Israel to do it. So the whole Zionist dream of a Jewish state is going to be gone, and Israel will become very much like Lebanon, with the Jews playing, you know, the Maronite Catholics as one ethnic group among others. So I think Rahm Emanuel, David Axelrod, Abner Mikva, the Chicago Jewish community around Obama wants a two-state solution quick because they can see that this is a disaster otherwise, and they can't understand why Bibi Netanyahu thinks he can swallow the whole West Bank. They think it's going to give him an enormous bellyache down the road. So they're going to try hard, and they already did get Netanyahu to announce an 8-month freeze on settlements in the West Bank proper, not in Jerusalem. And who knows, you know, I wouldn't have predicted that they could do that. So maybe there will be some progress on this. But I would say, you know, 90% of the problems the U.S. has in the Arab world come from the Arab-Israeli conflict and from the perception that the U.S. is not an honest broker and that it's pursuing policies that allow the Israelis to expropriate the Palestinians, that they're losing their property, their lives, their water, their resources gradually. There's a kind of creeping colonization of the West Bank, and that the Arabs just don't understand. Why would the U.S. think that's a good thing? Why wouldn't they stand up for the oppressed? And of course, from an American point of view, we're old friends with Israel. And we have an esteemed American Jewish community which supports Israel. And the Palestinians, you know, do blow up students at Hebrew University, which makes a bad impression. And so from the American point of view, the thing is phrased in terms of Israel's welfare and survival and Palestinian terrorism. In the Arab world, it's phrased in terms of creeping Israeli colonization of the West Bank and a kind of state terrorism against the Palestinians. And the Obama administration, it seems to me, is the best administration we've had on this issue really in a very long time. And so I'm hoping they'll be able to make success. And now we're in for this gamble in Afghanistan that increase in troops and counterinsurgency on a relatively short time scale can start to turn things around, and then we can, 18 months from now, begin a withdrawal. And I would say that's the gamble of the century so far. Obama is putting everything on the table. This is very high stakes. And we'll see whether it works out. So I would say the situation is night and day from a year ago. I think the rhetoric was overheated. I think the policies were wrong-headed. I think the U.S. is on a much better track now for good relations with the Muslim world, which I think are in turn central to the fortunes and the prosperity and the power of the United States in the world in the 21st century. I think John McCain had it exactly the opposite. It is the challenge of engaging the Muslim world, which is this transcendent challenge of the United States in the 21st century. And success on that endeavor will be success for the United States. Thank you very much.
You get a private mic here. Two things I'd like to say is that the proceedings are being recorded. So I'd invite you for any questions that you have. There are two mics here, and I believe there's one on this side. And while people are lining up, I would just like to say that one will be signing books after the Q&A is finished, just outside the door and to your left. So please join him there. If you have a private question or a follow-up on a question you ask here, try to grab him when he's out there, because he'll be there signing books instead of rushing the stage in a rather big style. So please.
When liberals try to justify President Obama's position on the war in Afghanistan, they talk about nuclear weapons in Pakistan, and sometimes they talk about the condition of women in Afghanistan. Could you comment on those two justifications for escalating the war there?
Right. That's a good point. Well, President Obama himself has alluded to the instability of Pakistan and the fact that it's a nuclear state. The fear has been expressed of Pakistani nukes falling into the hands of the Taliban. It's all crackpot talk. It's in my view, bizarre and ridiculous. David Kilcullen, who's styles himself a counterinsurgency expert from Australia, in the circle of the high officers of the Pentagon, talked about the danger of Pakistan falling to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban within 6 months. And it just depends on ignorance on the American public's part that we just don't call this nonsense. Pakistan has a 550,000 man army. It is a descendant of the British Indian Army. It is well-trained, well-equipped, and highly disciplined. It has never experienced a significant mutiny. There have been coups in Pakistan. All the coups have been made by the Chief of Staff. There's never been a junior officer's coup. Well, one was once attempted, but it was easily put down. So it is a disciplined organization, the Pakistani military, acquitted itself well in wars with India, which is a much bigger country and has a similarly well-equipped and well-trained military. The estimates last spring were that 4,000 Taliban fighters had taken the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan. 4,000? Against a 550,000 man army? I mean, the question was not, could the Pakistani army make mincemeat of them? The question is, would it? And the thing that the Americans didn't understand is that the northwest frontier of Pakistan is a clannish area. People are ethnically distinctive. They're Pashtuns. And there has been a tradition going back to the late 19th century in the British Empire, the British government of India, of not bothering those people too much. Because, like, they all do have guns, and they're clannish, and they would, kill you. And they were very troublesome if you tried to oppress them or even to tax them. The British fought 3 wars with Afghanistan. The third Afghan war was kind of a draw, but it was expensive for the British to prosecute. After it was over, the tribes of northern Pakistan revolted against the British. And it cost more money and more lives for the British to put down the Mahsud tribe in Waziristan than it had to prosecute the entire Third Afghan War. So the Pakistani military had a long tradition, in keeping with British traditions, of not asserting itself too heavy-handedly in that area. And so when the Taliban took Swat Valley, the Pakistani government was inclined to say, okay, don't make any more trouble than you have, and you can have Swat Valley. But then they were oppressing people in Swat, and they were beating up women, and the Obama administration put heavy pressure on them. So finally, they sent the military in. Now, this is a heavy-duty risk because they displaced 2 million people temporarily, and you could have had a big backlash against the government from the Pakistani people. But it turns out they caught a break. It was wildly popular. So the Pakistani public really has turned against the Taliban. They were very happy that the Pakistani military went in and took care of business, and now they're fighting another campaign in Waziristan. But this talk about the Pakistan falling to the Taliban or getting nukes, the Taliban have an 8th grade education. What would they do with a nuke? I think they're complicated. I don't think it's like, you just plug them in. In Pakistan, they don't keep them assembled. And you need permissions from the prime minister and the chief of staff and the president to assemble one. So the Taliban are going to get a hold of a nuke and deploy it how exactly? Pakistan has a big civil service. It's got a long tradition of governance. it's not, it's not a really backward kind of country. And having been part of British India means that it has these professional traditions. So the whole thing is bizarre. And I think personally that some people in Washington want to get nukes away from Pakistan, to reverse the Pakistani nuclear achievement of 1998, and that this is the way they put pressure on Pakistan. Say, well, you have this ramshackle, unstable government. You might lose control of these things. Why don't you give them to us? And I don't think it's going to fly because India has nukes, and as long as India does, Pakistan's going to keep its. But then the thing about women is, in the same way that you can't give people liberty at the point of a gun, you can't give women liberty at the point of a gun. And there's a lot of myth-making about this, which, frankly, the past administration was very good at. Bush, when he gave his State of the Union address, always had an Afghan professional woman up sitting in the balcony, and they would pan in on her and so forth. But this Karzai government that the U.S. put in power is the old Jamiat-e-Islami. It's a Muslim fundamentalist organization that we put in power. And they regiment women almost as badly as the Taliban. Not quite. The Taliban are weird about women. I think that's because a lot of them are orphans. Their parents were killed by the Soviets, and then they grew up in camps and they went to these madrasas where there was all boys. So I don't think they're like, they don't know any women. I think they're kind of like Star Wars fans, but much more malicious and misogynistic. But it is that maelstrom of social dislocation that produced this odd misogynist ideology of the Taliban, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Islam. All the other Muslims look at them and say, oh, those guys are weird. So I'm all for rights for Afghan women, but a war on the Pushtun people is not going to produce rights for women.
Sir.
You said in your book that calling for a one-state solution you find to be offensive. And so I just wanted to ask you, how much Palestine is Israel entitled to?
I said in my book that what was offensive?
You said calling for some variant of a one-state solution via elections is not the same as military aggression, however offensive the call may be.
Yeah, I was actually not talking about a
22.
one-state solution. I was talking about Ahmadinejad's version of the one-state solution, in which, like, Ashkenazi Jews wouldn't be able to vote and so on and so forth. I don't have a strong opinion on whether there should be a two-state solution or a one-state solution. My view is that the primary problem for the Palestinians is statelessness. And statelessness is objectionable because citizenship is a guarantor of rights. And Warren Burger
But is Israel entitled to any Palestinian land?
Well, let me finish what I'm saying. Warren Burger said that citizenship is the right to have rights. As long as the Palestinians are stateless, they have no right to have rights. And this is the key problem. So there are only two possible solutions of this problem. Well, there are three possible ones, I suppose. One would be a Palestinian state, in which case the Palestinians have rights. And the Arab Israelis, who are about a fifth of the Israeli population and going towards a fourth, also have citizenship and so have the right to have rights. Another possibility would be for the Palestinians to become, say, Jordanian citizens. But the Jordanian monarchy would never, ever agree to that. And it's not going to happen. The third possibility is that Israel would be forced by international boycotts and economic disaster for Israel, because Israel is a fragile economy and very dependent on international goodwill.
Could Israel be forced back to the 1947?
It would be forced then to grant the Palestinians citizenship and have a one-state solution.
Could
So
Israel
my
be
own
forced to the
position
47?
is, if you just let me finish, my own position is that the central problem here is Palestinian statelessness, and that it has to be resolved as a human rights issue. You can't leave millions of people stateless. In fact, that was the problem of the Jews in the 1930s, right? The Nazis declared them not German citizens, so they had their statehood removed. They were made non-citizens. And non-citizens are open to abuse. If somebody invaded your home while you're out here tonight and said, now this is our house, how would you get them back out of your house? Well, you'd have to produce a title deed, and the police would come and arrest these guys because you can prove that it's your house to the state. Your being a citizen gives you the right to own your house. If you don't have citizenship, and the police might not be interested in you. And that's why, illegal aliens are in such a difficult situation, and most often won't go to the police because they know that they won't get any help. Indeed, they might be deported. So the Palestinians have been denuded, deracinated of their citizenship by 1948, and they have no new citizenship, and it's unacceptable. There are only about 12 million people in the world who are stateless, by the way, and the Palestinians are the bulk of them. So I don't really care myself whether there's a one-state solution or a two-state solution or a three-state solution. I'm not interested in state solutions. I'm interested in an arrangement being made for the Palestinians to have rights. Rights to their own property, rights to pursue their own lives as they want, to not have people forcing them off their land, stealing their water.
Will the division made by the two-state solution, won't that line of division create another pretext for continued war?
Not necessarily. Actually, I think if you had gotten to a two-state solution in 1999-2000 under Clinton, that the whole issue would have gone away.
So the Palestinians would relinquish 60% of.
Yeah, I know what the issues are. Okay. I have a friend who studied the Algerian Revolution against the French. And from 1954 to 1962, Algeria was on the front page of the Algerian newspapers, of the French newspapers every day. As soon as Algeria became independent, within a year, by 1963, Algeria was not in the French newspapers. The political solutions create a different mood. They create a different public sentiment. If a Palestine had been arrived at in 2000, I personally think the whole issue would have quickly gone away. And the Israelis and the Palestinians need each other. The Palestinians are labor. The Israelis have technology. The whole thing would have been settled. It is the central issue, the thing that drives the continued violence and instability and uncertainty is Palestinian statelessness and Israeli settlements.
Okay. Yes?
I was just wondering if a two-state solution would come about, where exactly would the territory come from? Because it seems like Israel's getting a little crowded, and once you bring all the Palestinian refugees back in, it seems like it'd just be even more crowded. Where can you draw the line? Because it's not like any of these, countries around them are, inclined to give up territory. So.
Right. Well, what the Palestinians want is the West Bank and Gaza inside 1967, which is to say 1949 boundaries. There is a problem with that insofar as there are lots of Israeli settlements outside the Green Zone in Palestinian territory. Tzipi Livni was inclined to just move the settlers, most of them, maybe not the big settlement of Ariel, but most of them. And people asked her, she's a major Israeli leader, could have been prime minister. People asked her, well, wouldn't that cause problems if you tried to move all those Israeli settlers out of the West Bank? But she's become convinced in a two-state solution. And she said, well, that's what the police are there for. A very Central European kind of thinking. So, look, the issue is for the Israelis to commit to a two-state solution and for the Palestinians to find a formula that their present political configuration can live with in this regard. And the details of it can be worked out. Even Ehud Barak seems to have at least orally suggested you could take part of Israeli territory, the Galilee, which is heavily Arab, and give it to the Palestinians. And that way Israel would have fewer Arab citizens, and it would lose a little bit of territory, but so what? It would keep Ariel. And the square footage would be the same 1967 square footage. And of course, and I'm not sure that the Palestinians would reject that. The Israeli Arabs were very upset. They said, don't you love us?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Cole, you amply described how we in this country have demonized the Muslim world. And my question relates to basically what I would call a culture war, a religious war. In the pilgrimage of 2006, 2 million Muslims made a pilgrimage to Mecca. And at that time, the Grand Mufti, Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, gave a sermon. And I just wanted to give you a few words of what he said. He said, "O Muslim nation, there's a war against our creed, against our culture, under the pretext of fighting terrorism. We should stand firm and united in protecting our religion. Islam's enemies want to empty our religion of its contents and its meaning. But the soldiers of God will be victorious." I think if you have an insight into Muslim psyche, globally speaking, what would that be in that context?
Yeah. Well, a lot of Muslims do feel that they're being unfairly tarred with the brush of terrorism because of a few radicals from their community. And, sociologists talk about marked and unmarked identities. So if a white guy robs a bank, the way it's going to appear in the newspapers, bank robbed. But if a member of a minority group robbed a bank, then they're marked. That member of that ethnic group robbed the bank. It's because the majority is considered the normal and so isn't marked, and others are marked. And the Muslims have become very marked as an identity, and so it impacts them. In fact, the Muslims have been marked not only as terrorists, but also as immigrants. So you've got Muslims, in Iowa who have been here since the 1910s, and all of a sudden people are looking at them as sort of, why don't you go back where you came from? And they say, what, Duluth? And so, what the Sheikh was saying is that even in the Middle East, they feel this, that their religion is being mischaracterized. John Hagee, the evangelical leader, sort of implies that the Quran commands Muslims just to fall upon non-Muslims and kill them. But this is not true. I mean, it's ridiculous. The Quran forbids murder. And actually, in the medieval world, the Quran was, I think, probably the most progressive document with regard to interreligious relations, because it said, in a Muslim society, Christians and Jews have a right to worship, have a right to life and property. They can't be arbitrarily deprived of it. And it's true that they were considered protective communities and so kind of second-class citizens. But this was in the 600s of the Common Era, at a time when Christians were being fed to lions by the Romans, and that was the world we're talking about. And well, it was a little bit after that, but the point being that religious tolerance in the Mediterranean world was not at its height. And then it got worse. During the Roman Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition, all Jews were made to leave Spain, and or if they stayed, they had to convert to Catholicism, and all Muslims were made to leave Spain or convert. And the document that Ferdinand and Isabella issued in this regard actually said that the reason that they insisted on expelling the Muslims was that they had tolerated Jews. And in Britain, France, Italy, there were long stretches of time not allowed for Jews to live in Europe, or Muslims for that matter. And at the same time, in Baghdad, you had thriving Jewish and Christian communities, churches and synagogues, interreligious debates, Plato and Aristotle being invoked, and so forth. So I don't want to say that the medieval Muslim world was always a paradise. There were instances of persecution of minorities, there were pogroms, there were some certifiably crazy kings who did horrible things. But with regard to law and the cumulative practice of the Middle East, a place was made for non-Muslims in Muslim society. This was not true in much of European tradition until the Enlightenment, really. You know, kind of the Europeans maybe got ahead of the Muslims with regard to human rights only around 1789. This idea that Muslims are commanded to kill non-Muslims is stupid and incorrect, and it comes partly out of a misunderstanding of Muslim history. Islam developed in a pagan society, and the pagans really, really didn't like Islam because it was monotheistic. And they were very attached to the idea of multiple gods, and moreover, the monotheists, are a little bit annoying to pagans because they do things like say that they're going to hell. And in Arab society, people are very proud of their families and their father, their grandfather. So the pagans would say to the Muslims, they said, so you're saying I'm going to hell. What about my father? Oh, he's already there. So they said, well, you want a piece of me? So there was a lot of trouble about Islam in a pagan society like Mecca. And they persecuted the Muslims, and they were going to try to wipe them out altogether, just strangle this thing in its cradle. So when they came with swords to kill the Muslims, the Quran, through the Prophet Muhammad, tells the Muslims, don't, put your neck down to be cut off. Fight back. Kill them wherever you find them if they're trying to kill you. So it's not a pacifist tradition, but it's not an aggressive tradition. This was a command to self-defense. And so when you read the Quran and it says things like kill them wherever you find them, you think, well, gee, how barbaric. But if you know the historical context in which that was said, it's very different. It's like Rumsfeld said we should find Al-Qaeda and kill it, right? Well, it wasn't something he would have said in 2000. It was as a result of 9/11. So likewise, the Muslims were protecting themselves from the pagans whom they called kuffar or infidels. And technically speaking in the Quran, Christians and Jews are never ever called infidels in the same way to Qur. It refers to pagans. So John Hagee reads that kill them wherever you find them and whatever, that the Muslims must be commanded to kill Christians wherever they find them. And it's just a misunderstanding of reality. I have to say there are a handful of Muslims who have the same misunderstanding, but there are crazy people in every religion.
We'll go for our final questions off to the left here. Yeah.
Mr. Cole, thanks for coming out, first of all. I guess the question I have is, it seems like traditionally in Middle Eastern type countries, Western-style democracy has not happened, and it's probably will not going to happen in Iraq or Afghanistan anytime soon. Now, number one, I just want to see what your outlook is on that for the Muslim culture or Islamic culture, whatever you want to call it, to absorb Western-style freedom and democracy, things like that. And also, my second part of it is, according to your chart, it looks like Western cultures are on the decline population-wise, whereas Islamic type people are on the increase. So it seemed like, more or less, instead of democracy increasing in those areas, it seemed like their culture, which has been traditionally authoritarian, is going to go on the increase as their influence spreads throughout the world.
Thank you for your question. Well, the question assumes a kind of cultural connection between Islam and authoritarian governance, which I would challenge. And I just want to remind you, if you go back and read the political science literature in the 40s and 50s, it is alleged that Confucian cultures are inevitably authoritarian and incompatible with democracy. And that kind of thing kept on being said, but in the last few decades, you had Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. The Confucian cultures seem to have been perfectly happy to have parliamentary governance. So an assumption that a cultural tradition dictates political form seems to me awfully tricky. There must be other things going on there because it changes, and over time. Things open up or they don't. And with regard to the Muslim countries, my own view is most of them were formed by the colonial experience. Their immediate background is not Islamic governance. Algeria hadn't been governed by Muslims since 1830. They were governed by French. And the British were in Pakistan and India and so forth. And I think that colonial governments are not about democracy. they're about instruments of control of subjects so as to extract resources from the colonized. And if that's your heritage, if that's how Egypt and Algeria and Morocco and Pakistan had been governed, then when they become independent, they don't inherit, Rousseau or Mills. They inherit, the viceroys' ways of doing things. So there's usually censorship laws on the books. There's usually laws to forbid public disturbances and demonstrations. And so all of the Bill of Rights kinds of freedoms the United States got are typically denied in colonial governments, and then they get picked up by the independent governments. And this happened not only in the Muslim world, but in much of Africa, for instance. The other thing to say is that countries that have a very valuable primary commodity, whether it's petroleum or cocaine or opium, but have a difficulty transitioning to democracy because the government or militias get the revenue and they become more powerful than society. It causes violence. It can contribute to authoritarian government. It gives the government the tools to buy off people and so forth. So I think that since so much of the Muslim world does have a valuable primary commodity of that sort, their governmental structures may be being distorted by these economic factors rather than so much the Muslim tradition. But in the early 20th century, there were plenty of parliamentary governments in the Muslim world. Iran had a parliamentary government, and we overthrew it in 1953. And now we say we want them to be democratic. That's our dearest wish. Well, President Eisenhower, maybe you shouldn't have done that if that was your dearest wish. And then you see Lebanon has had parliamentary rule for much of its post-colonial history. And Pakistan. That's another thing, is how people think about things is important. In the last 3 years, Pakistan went from a military dictatorship to a democratic government. Indonesia in the last decade has gone from a military government to a democracy. These are two of the most populous countries in the Muslim world. Have you seen any newspaper articles? Headline, largest Muslim countries in the world move to democracy. No, we hear instability in Pakistan. Taliban might get their nukes. We don't hear military dictatorship overthrown by street protests, Pakistan People's Party elected by popular acclaim. So I think there is a lot of democracy in the Muslim world which doesn't get recognized as such. It's interpreted in the Wall Street Journal as instability. And then there are cross-cutting factors like rentier states or oil states or primary commodity states. And then there's the colonial heritage, which hasn't been helpful. But I think we have to see, but General Mubarak will presumably pass from the scene before all of his people emigrate. And maybe not so long from now, he'll step down or pass on. And at that point, does Egypt open up? We don't know. That would be a very important development if it occurred, because Egypt is kind of a trendsetter for the Arab world. So I would just caution you that there have been these myths about incompatibility of cultural traditions, whether it's Confucian or Eastern European. Greek Orthodoxy, didn't produce many democracies in the 20th century until very recently. And that there are other reasons for which things are as they are, but also that things are fluid. And you wouldn't have predicted in 1975 that South Korea would be a thriving democracy and the world's 10th largest economy in only a few decades.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me, can I add something on that too? Another thing I see is a pattern in all those countries that you mentioned. Those countries have accepted secular type ideas and have become secularized. They're not necessarily Muslim in their or Islamic in their tradition, as countries like Saudi Arabia or the other ones that are traditionally authoritarian.
Yeah, well, I could just say that I don't think that whether people are religious or not is the most important thing. The Greek Orthodox tradition has a lot of power in Greece. much more so than most Western countries would give their religious institutions. The Poles, when they made the revolution against the Soviet Union, did on religious bases, and they gave the Catholic Church control over what was on television and so forth. There are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that are Buddhist, which have elections. So I don't think that whether people are religious or not is the most important thing. I really would discount that.
Yes, sir. No.
I'd like to ask you to comment, if you would, on President Obama's policies toward Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last year, which were just solidified and presented to the American people and to the world just this last week, but obviously have been going on for a while. And then if you have some criticisms, which I would suspect you will have, what would you suggest? What kind of, if you had his ear, what would you suggest he do?
Yeah. Well, with regard to Pakistan, the Obama administration came into office determined that the Pakistani military and government should own the problem of the Pakistani Taliban. And so I think enormous arm twisting was applied to get the Pakistani military to go into the Swat Valley and unseat the Taliban, which is in Pakistan territory, and then to go into South Waziristan. And so Obama succeeded, and in a way, this is epical. He reversed a policy that had been in place since Churchill was in Waziristan as a young man in the late 1890s, of direct government intervention from the central government in the Pushtun tribal areas. And I have to say, has been more successful in that regard than I would have predicted. A, I wouldn't have thought that the Pakistani military would cave to his pressure and do this. B, I was surprised at how the Pakistani public swung around behind the government against the Taliban. I was fearful of a backlash, and it didn't happen so far. So I think that's been a real success in Pakistan, and then Obama is offering the Pakistanis $7.5 billion in civilian aid, which is tied in part to guarantees that the civilian government would remain in control of the Pakistani military. And I can't tell you how upset the Pakistani military was at the very idea, but it seems to be going through. So, I'd say, on the whole, by and large, Obama's had great success in Pakistan in turning things around. And, the previous administration just let the generals do whatever they want. And apparently, they were screwing us over. They're taking our money and giving it to the Taliban, in part, and spending the rest on fighting India, which wasn't why we gave it to them. The one drawback, I think, is this drone program that they have where they're trying to kill Al-Qaeda members and Taliban leaders with remote-controlled drones. I think the Pakistani government protests too much. I think that it's hand in glove with this policy, but then they come out in public, say we protest and so forth. These things are taking off from Pakistani air bases. The Pakistani military is up to their hips in this, but they want to blame the United States for it. And it's not popular with the public. And I'm not sure whether it's a wise policy. But the other things that have been done seem to me quite successful. Obama supported the democratization movement against Musharraf while he was a candidate. Mr. McCain did not. He supported Musharraf. So I think we caught a break in that we're on the same page, generally speaking, with the Pakistani public on a lot of important issues. With regard to Afghanistan, Obama came into office determined to unseat President Hamid Karzai. I think he thought that Karzai is a screw-up, he's undependable, he's a micromanager of the unimportant things and pays no attention to the big things. He only controls 30% of the country. He's been there for so long, he doesn't seem to have been able to get control of the army. And so Obama wanted him out. And was hoping, I think, that these August 20 presidential elections would produce an alternative president. But Karzai brazenly stole that election, rather stymieing Obama. And Karzai's main opponent, Abdullah Abdullah, became so disgusted with the shenanigans that he pulled out of the race. So Obama got stuck not only with an ineffective Karzai, but now with the Karzai who's been delegitimized by a fraudulent election. On the other hand, he knows with what he's working. And presumably all of this played into his decision about what to do and he's decided that he has to do major counterinsurgency. If you had a different kind of leader in Kabul, maybe you could hope that the Afghans would take things in hand themselves. But Karzai's obviously not going to do that, very likely. So I think he's decided that, okay, Petraeus and McChrystal will have to do it. So they're going to put U.S. troops into Afghan villages, try to convince the Afghan villagers to like white Christian foreign soldiers better than they like their cousins in the Taliban, and to be assured that we will protect them from the Taliban, and get them to support the Karzai government, maybe give them some aid, development, and then at the same time train the new Afghan army like crazy, double its size and double the size of the police, and hope that in about 18 months they begin to start claiming some territory away from the Taliban themselves, so that as they do so, we can start pulling some of our troops out. I can't tell you how unlikely things are to go that way. But Obama has surprised me before. I don't completely count him out. I think that Joe Biden was right, that you want a light touch, you do counterterrorism. There's nothing wrong with training the army, but you don't have to try to occupy the country while you're doing it. There's a real danger that the Pashtun tribes people will mind all those foreign troops being sent into their territory, and that you'll achieve the opposite result of the one you wanted, which is that you'll stir them up rather than calming them down.
Okay, and our final question?
Yes, actually it was concerning U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, but you fairly well answered that question. Another question would be, the CIA has been reported as giving Karzai's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, payoffs to recruit for the Kandahar Strike Force. In so doing, isn't the United States government sanctioning lawlessness that's been attributed to that force?
Right, so the issue is CIA payoffs to Afghan politicians. You know, if you're going to be in Afghanistan, you're going to get involved with dirty things. I mean, it is a lawless frontier, clannish society. Everybody's got feuding going on. I mean, I fall down laughing when I hear people saying that, you know, Afghan governance has to become more transparent and less corruption. Nothing happens in Afghanistan without a bribe. You can't get breakfast without a bribe. You're not going to move millions of dollars without a bribe. So I kind of think it's a non-story. Like, you could have a headline every day, such and such Afghan politician on CIA payroll. The big story is, it seems to me, that Karzai's brothers, the President Karzai's brothers, are accused of being corrupt and being big players behind the scenes. There's kind of Karzai Inc. running Afghanistan, and in it for themselves rather than for the public good. So there is a real issue there, but what would you do about it exactly? You know, we don't want to go down that route that we went in Vietnam, where, you know, leaders we don't like after a while aren't there any longer. I just think that we have to be very realistic about Afghanistan, and a lot of people are not. You know, women are not going to be well treated in that country for a while. It's the fifth poorest country in the world. It's just not going to be Sweden. You know, the best you can hope for, and they're going to feud with each other. There's going to be violence. And some of it, you know, you can say it's Taliban or you call it what you want. But they're going to be feuding with each other on some basis. So the best you can hope for is to more or less calm it down a bit and then get out and hope they don't follow you home. And I'm hoping that's what we'll do.
Thank you.